This is the Content and AI Podcast, episode number 12. The arrival of large language models and chatbots like OpenAI's ChatGPT, Anthropic's Claude, and Google's Bard is creating both existential concerns and new opportunities for content professionals. In their work as a content designer at Google and through their extensive professional networking, Laura Costantino has had the chance to witness the full range of work experiences and personal emotions that come with the rapid adoption of new artificial intelligence practices.
Welcome to the Content and AI Podcast, where experts on artificial intelligence share their wisdom with the content community. Our mission is to demystify and democratize AI, to make its principles and practices accessible to all content practitioners. And now here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 12 of the Content and AI Podcast. I am really delighted today to welcome to the show Laura Costantino. Laura is a senior content designer at Google, doing really interesting work around AI and content stuff. So welcome, Laura. Tell the folks a little bit about your role there at Google.
Hi, Larry. Thanks for having me. It's so nice to be here. Yeah, so I've been at Google for about a year and a half, but somewhat recently, maybe 3.5, 4 months ago, I moved from my previous team to my current team, and I am at the moment working as a senior content designer training large language models. So that's my new job.
Well, training large language models at like one of the biggest tech companies in the world, that's pretty interesting, especially for folks in the content world. There's so much to ask about that. What I guess the first thing I'd ask is what's the biggest change? Like, what's the biggest difference in training a language model versus the content design work you were doing like a year ago?
Yeah, that's a great question. I came up to content design through content strategy and to an extent marketing as well. And so I think, for me, it really helped to have that content strategy background, meaning really being familiar with the content at scale, content governance, and I think that's been the biggest difference for me, that in my current role, I had to sort of like go back to my past and brush up on some of that, of those skills that I think I learned more in the past. Versus in my most recent roles as a content designer, I think my day-to-day was still a little bit more, writing strings, and felt a little bit more like bespoke and kind of, I don't want to say in the moment, because of course, ideally it wouldn't be in the moment, but unfortunately, sometimes it is in the moment when someone like asks you to, write a string or edit a string, versus right now, I do think my role is it's a lot more focused on the strategy at scale. And I do think it's a function of the role more than, say, like me, growing in my career or something.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's so interesting because when you think about it, because most content design roles, like you just said, you're embedded in a specific product, working on just strings and error messages and but also the narrative of the whole product and all that stuff. But then you
Right.
move up a notch to this kind of thing, and all of a sudden, like, boy, I'm glad I have this content strategy background because I need it again. Tell me a little bit about like how that manifests in training a large language model. Like, what are it seems clear. I think I get why you need to be strategic about it, but can you talk a little bit about why you've had to go back in your toolbox for your content strategy stuff?
Yeah, of course. So, training data for a large language model, I mean, of course, we're talking about volume of data that are really like hard to wrap our heads around. And, two sorts of like techniques, and one in particular that we've been using, that are used, I guess, like to train large language model, or fine tuning, and reinforcement learning, and there is all sorts of like methodologies, right, that are used. And most methodologies require to look at content at scales, right? Like ingest, And some of the technicalities, I admit, I don't fully understand myself, right? But I create sort of like metaphors in my mind, or like images of how I think certain things work. And, I always imagine these like large quantities of like data, which in this case is really content, right? Sentences and words and so on and so forth being ingested into these kind of, right, like box, and that then creates more content out of it, right? And so for me, I think, in that sense, I mean, working on content at scale, because some of the content is content that is created by UX, but we also work with a lot of other people, right? So it's not so much like me as a content designer, I have a full handle on all the strings that are gonna go into a flow. That's just not gonna happen, right? And so it's more kind of like creating the guidelines, and some of that, of course, is the work of a content designer. But I think here it becomes even a little bit more, not just like the guidelines in terms of like style and voice and tone, but also like operationally, how do we make sure that creating content at scale can work for the team to a scale that is like big enough that it helps like training the model.
Yeah. As you talk about that, I'm wondering, like, first, there's two things in there that really interest me. There's one is the sort of the something you're using content as data, and then data as a design material. So are you looking like for patterns in the data and the content, or because at scale you can't just look at every data point and go like, oh, we'll treat this one this way. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's that's exactly it. And I think, that's again going back to what I was saying, right? Like my days as a content strategist, and doing some sort of like, for example, like taxonomy work, or thinking about like in the past, right, like how to label certain kind of data. And this isn't necessarily what I do now, but when I did that in the past, when I work on like categorizing content, I mean, a lot of what I had to do was like looking at patterns, right, and trying to figure out, and I have been in my head a little bit, and sort of like loosely wanting to use the Pareto principle, if I remember correctly, right? Like 20, percent is kind of like reflects the rest of the 80%. Like you only need 20%. Maybe this isn't a really good explanation, but that's what I think, right? Like sort of like sampling through the data and trying to find patterns, just like you said, and seeing, how the model is responding, and from that figuring out how do we constantly sort of like improve it, right, with new training data.
Yeah, and you talked about that because you're actually in there training the model, and you mentioned two terms there, fine tuning and reinforcement learning. I kind of I always say, I mean, here's my little tiny brain's interpretation of this, that fine tuning seems like going one level deeper than prompt engineering and kind of doing like higher level fine tuning of the model itself. And then reinforcement learning, as I understand, is like a neural network thing that's like a Skinner box kind of reinforcement, giving little pellets to the food pellets to the model when it gets something right. Is that kind of how it works, or?
I mean, from my understanding, yes, right. Like the reinforce is a little bit more like saying this is good, this is bad, right, in a very simplified way, and that's but that's one side of it, and then the other side, the fine tuning, like right now for me has been more working with like really large a really large scale of content, like a really large amount of model responses.
Yeah. Hey, and you talked to you when you first started talking about this, you mentioned that the ultimate goal out of all this work with the modeling and your work in general is to operationalize it, to like get it kind of ensconced in like your day-to-day work, I guess. How does that differ? Because I've seen and done a lot of that kind of work in the content design world, but in the AI world, not so much. How does it look how does operationalization look in your world?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because I do think we're um figuring it out. I am sure it's happening in a lot of other places, right, where we are in a moment of figuring how things work and learning from what's happening and trying, to take those learnings and make them into some kind of a process. And I have to say, it's just sort of like constantly changing, right? So for me, the idea of operationalizing things is also a little bit more of like how I see it would ideally work in the future to an extent, like, because again, I think that, the main difference of what, or one of the big differences, is that we cannot think about content in a very, we cannot think about our work more than content, I should say, as very sort of like bespoke, wordsmithing or anything like that.
Right, that's interesting because and you mean like in a UI, for example, you might have like a specific piece of guidance copy for a certain particular action in there, whereas here it's like, no, this is all data driven. We have to have something more less bespoke and more systematizable or something like that.
Yeah,
Is that?
yeah.
Yeah, got
Yeah,
it.
definitely. And like I know, the design systems and obviously content design systems are obviously already a step toward that. I would say, um this is maybe the next evolution to that, right? Whereas like design systems, content design systems are for people to use. This is sort of like for people and the model, right? In the machine to use. Yeah.
Yeah, as you talk about that, I'm reminded like, wait, material design, that's your design system, right? At Google. It's
Yeah, it's a
but
Google
I've talked to other people who said, I can't, God, sorry, I've talked to too many people, but somebody was telling me like how they've hardly had to create any new components in their design system as they work, that they already had stuff there. Are you finding in your is have you had to do any additional work with the design system folks to accommodate the kind of work you're doing now?
Um, interesting that you ask that, because this actually comes from a time before I even joined this new team and started working on LLMs. I me and a bunch of folks here at Google have sort of like started talking, right? All content designers, UX writers, and try to figure out together in a sort of like very grassroots way how we approach AI, and how we think about it as content designers, through a number of different angles, right? One of them being like guidelines, terminology, etc., etc. So we created this sort of, again, fully like volunteer um, group of people that are just sort of like knowledge sharing, right? And saying, this is what we're doing in this product area and this product area and this product area, sharing our knowledge, finding commonalities, finding what's different, what works in a certain area versus what may not, and just honestly like trying to be as flexible as possible, and eventually maybe create some kind of like guidelines that we can all sort of follow. But right now, the speed of things changing is just been so fast that it's more been, um, like I said, kind of like a knowledge sharing, exercise to make sure that we break through some of those, silos that just exist in a lot of companies, and just make sure that we are more collaborative with each other.
Yeah, because you think of Google, I mean, most people just think of search, but there's a ton of products there and a ton of different teams and a lot of folks to learn from.
Yeah.
So I'd say, but the thing that's driving that, and we talked about this a little bit before we hit the record button, is that change, that there's this kind of relentless pace of change. We're all feeling it, everything around AI. Um, can you talk a little bit about, and we talked a little bit about how you cope with that, but I think we all would love all the advice we can get about how to cope with change in this wacky new world of AI.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I don't have a magical solution for everyone, but I would say, A couple of things that you and I have discussed and that have been on my mind lately. For me, it's been a process of trying to get more comfortable with not being in control of everything, right? And going a little bit more with the flow. And granted, it doesn't work every day. And some days, I think that's why sometimes also my effort to say, let's create a process around this, let's create a process around that. But sometimes it is a matter of just like being adaptable and honestly, I think being collaborative, right? Being collaborative and communicating a lot. I think that's what's been helping. And when those lines of communication, I think that break, that's a little bit when the problems come, right? This isn't a work that content design can do alone. This isn't work that UX can do alone. This isn't work that engineering can do alone, right? And I mean, that applies to everything, is probably not different than before, but in my mind, even more so right now. I think that collaboration is really important because also different discipline, not to mention different people, come from different perspectives. So making sure that those perspectives are heard, I think it is really important to all kind of like go through that change together, right?
Yeah, and as you're talking about that, I'm wondering the collaboration, the list of folks you just mentioned is a very familiar one. But I wonder, are there different? There's probably some new or slightly different flavored collaborators that you're working with, like probably more data scientists, and machine learning engineers, and
Yeah,
yeah.
uh-huh. Yeah, definitely. I've had the I would say like the pleasure of working with research scientists, and for me has been
Hmm.
probably one of the more interesting like things about the role that that was maybe a function that I wasn't as connected to before. Although in past roles, I had worked very closely with data science actually. Because again, for me, my I think a lot of, for one coincidence or another, like I remember at some point I work on help center stuff, right? So that too, content at scale was a big thing. And so a lot of the data I would get would be from data scientists more than necessarily like UX research. But yeah, research science been has been kind of like sort of like a new partner. Um, and then like you said, engineering, different functions across UX. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. As you said, that pairing that you just mentioned, I'm really curious about that because I think of like research as like more customer facing or problem space facing, and then the data science, data being like the sort of like all the instances of stuff laying around the organization. And a lot of the work I do has been at the juncture of those two, like pulling together, looking at all the instances to get ideas about what's going on, and then thinking about the research that you've got. But in your case, you're talking more to like data scientists than research scientists. Is that sort of what's
In this case, I mean, at the moment is more research scientists. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so that's not, I mean, we all deal with UX researchers a lot, I think. But is there a difference in dealing like talking with a research scientist? Like are these like hardcore like PhD data scientists kind of t folks?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Definitely.
No, I've met a few people at Google and that's how they all profile. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So
No, that's definitely the case. That's why I'm saying for me it's kind of a new experience in that sense because I think maybe like one of the challenges and at the same time like exciting part of all these is there is like a lot of theory behind it, right? And a lot of science behind it, of course. But at the end of the day, like we're also making it real to an extent, right? And making it happen. And so UX is very much that layer of like, okay, there is like all this theory, and then once we make it an experience for people, we have to also think about the people, right? And
mhm.
so sort of like making some of that theory concrete, I guess that's simply what I'm saying, and making it usable and making it responsible. And yeah.
Yeah, and as you're saying that, I'm thinking that like it's probably like it's not like everything is settled in like UX practice, but there's it feels more settled that there's kind of like like heuristics and traditional ways of doing things where so much of this language model stuff is so new. And is that why you're working so it's almost like you're going upstream a little bit, working with more like research scientists than practice researchers? Is that you're nodding your head a little bit?
Yeah, that's what I felt, honestly, right? And I think that for me personally, what's been so exciting about the work that I felt a little bit less far removed from the technology itself. And even though I by no means am an expert at the technology, but I definitely have an opportunity to challenge myself to try and understand more how the technology behind these works. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
Well, and that goes to what you were saying before too about just change and coping with it, being, resilient and ready for the next thing, which kind of leads actually something else I wanted to ask you about for sure. We talked about this a little bit before we went on the air, is that there's along with change comes a lot of uncertainty. And there's a lot of people in this field now who are, genuinely worried about their livelihood and their jobs going forward. What's your feel for that? Like in your experience as you've worked with this, do you see fewer opportunities, more opportunities, different opportunities for content folks going forward?
Yeah. I mean, that's a question I get a lot. And I think I am choosing to be cautiously optimistic. And I'm saying, I'm choosing to because I do think it's one easy to get into the doomsday prediction, which I don't think are helpful to anyone. It's also easy to see problems that already have kind of like come up, even in the news or whatever with the technology. But as it is happening, that's why I say it is happening, so I am choosing to be cautiously optimistic and try to see what the positive outcomes may be. And I don't want to be naive about it by any means. I hope it doesn't sound that way. I think it's more, especially as a content designer, as someone who's been working with content for a really long time now, I am trying to see the opportunities in doing the work, right? And so that being strategic, that's why I think I have I wanted to bring up content at scale because I also wanted to be maybe a kernel of inspiration for people, who do this job to start thinking what that may look like for me. And so I think that is like one thing. And the other thing, which we've spoken about already, that piece of collaboration. If people ask me like how do I approach this, aside from obviously like start looking for podcasts like yours and other resources online, but also go talk to the people in your company, if you work at a company, or people in your network, if maybe you're freelancing and stuff that are doing the work, right? Make your engineer your one of your closest friends for sure, like, and the engineers that are working on this. I From what I hear, right, from colleagues, um at conferences and places like these, it sounds like a lot of companies are looking into like how do they expand even more so into AI. And so if there is an effort already happening, what I'm saying, right, like if you work at a company, try to get involved as much as possible. And often it's just done through talking to people. And even for me to change role, I should say I had to raise my hand, of course. I was lucky to be in the right place at the right moment, and that was beyond my control, but I also had to raise my hand and say, yes, please, I want to learn about this, I would love to be involved.
Yeah, that being out there, for folks who are, you mentioned like, because not everybody is in a position right now where they can kind of do that. Do you have, just for folks who want to get started, like, are there ways that you can experiment with this or learn about it, regardless of where you're at?
um yeah, I mean, different AI chatbots are available and somewhat, have somewhat of a low barrier to entry because it is just a chatbot. So I'd say first step is definitely just that, right? Using it, trying to figure out situations that make sense to you, whether it's, in your work, sometimes it's harder, right? Because there's also a lot of concerns around like privacy and what data you may share with an AI chatbot. Um, but I think, it's also maybe just like trying to figure out what are some use cases that may work for you. Um, and even sometimes maybe in your daily life, I've definitely seen millions of lists that are like the best, prompts for prompt engineering or whatever. And I'm like, yes, but also no, right? It all kind of has to work for you, for your user, for your use case, for your context, right? So it's like, yeah, there is a lot of material out there, but I think for me, it's more like how can you yourself experiment with it?
Yeah, that's you just articulated exactly why I started this podcast and why I want to have people like you on here, because the web is just full of information of that kind of unsolicited advice now. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure there's better ideas out there. So thanks for sharing that. Hey, I can't believe it, Laura. We're already coming up close to time, but I want to give you a chance. Is there anything last before we wrap up? Is there anything that you want to revisit from the conversation or just share before we leave?
Yeah, really what I was saying now, which, I'm trying to find different ways to say in a way that does sound, I think, encouraging to people, and make them feel like they can hopefully, have a voice and ideally even like a part in the way, if not how AI is developed per se, but at least like not being not having something that happens to them, if that makes sense, right? And
Hmm.
maybe this point of view comes from the fact that so a while ago, right, when I was much younger and I went to school, I actually studied media. And so, some of my perspective I do think comes from like media studies and cultural studies. And part of that is with any new media that comes along, comes this idea that we can either look at it with critical thinking. And that's why so many scholars have written so much about films and TV and so on and so forth, because the idea is like we need to develop critical thinking when it comes to all sorts of type of media, and I guess expand that to all sorts of type of content. And so I think this is sort of like my I don't know, quote unquote call to action for people to start finding ways to develop their own critical thinking, right? Their own regarding to AI specifically, right? And really what I'm saying is like make your own opinion. Don't just wait for people to tell you what it is, but start looking at it with a critical eye and form your own opinion as you use it.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that a little bit because you were reminding me as you were talking that like these are large language models and we're the language people and we have an opinion and a point of view to bring to this. I think all of us do. So I love the way you, yeah, I appreciate your call to action. Thanks. Hey, one very last thing, Laura. What's the best way for folks if they want to connect with you or follow you online? What's the best place?
Yeah, as you know, I'm quite active on LinkedIn, and that's definitely the best way. My DMs are open. I usually answer. It's very unlikely that I don't answer to a direct message, and so yeah, connect with me on LinkedIn. Send me a direct message, even if you just want to chat about what we talked about today or have any question, and I'll always do my best to answer.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Laura. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Same. Thank you, Larry. It was so nice seeing you.
For show notes and to sign up for our newsletter, visit our website at contentandai.com. And please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for listening.